Sarah had always known the life of a rancher would not be easy. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but it had always been home. The wind howled through the mountains, and the days stretched long under the burning sun or bitter cold. She had grown up on this ranch, learning to do things for herself. She had to. There were no neighbors close by to help when things went wrong, and the ranch was too far from town to rely on anyone but herself. That day, she had been out near the barn, working on repairs. Her hand was steady as she wielded the old rusty tool, tightening a bolt on the wooden structure. The cold steel slipped from her grip for just a moment and she reached out to catch it, but it was too late. The sharp edge of the tool sliced into her leg before she could pull back. The pain was immediate and intense, like fire racing through her veins. She gasped, staggering back, feeling the blood begin to run down her leg, soaking into the dirt beneath her boots. It was worse than she had expected. She collapsed onto the ground, her breath ragged and quick. Her hand pressed against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but the blood just kept flowing. Her heart pounded in her chest and her vision blurred as the pain became almost too much to bear. But Sarah couldn't afford to panic. She had always been tough, always found a way to push through. With shaking hands, she fumbled to tie a cloth around the wound, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the world slipping away, and though she fought it, the darkness began to pull at her mind. It was then that she heard the sound of hooves approaching. At first she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but the sound grew louder. Someone was coming. Sarah managed to lift her head, her eyes blurry from the pain, and through the haze she saw him. James, the rancher from the neighboring property. He was known for his quiet nature and for being a man of few words. She had seen him from a distance many times, but they had never really spoken. He lived alone, much like her, but she had heard stories about him, stories of his strength and his calm. James didn't say anything as he rode up to her. His eyes locked onto her injured leg, and without hesitation, he dismounted his horse and knelt beside her. He didn't ask her if she was okay, didn't ask her how it happened. He simply took action. His hands, though steady with experience, were shaking. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too focused on her own pain to pay attention to anything else. But as he gently moved her hand away from the wound, she felt his fingers tremble as they touched her skin. His hands, though rough and worn from years of hard work, were trembling more than they should. James wasn't used to this. He had seen many injuries in his time, but something about Sarah's pain hit him harder than he expected. His breath caught in his throat as he worked to clean the wound, his hands shaking with each movement. He didn't want her to see it, didn't want her to see how vulnerable he felt, but it was impossible to hide. "Hold still," he said quietly, his voice deep and calm. Though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty, Sarah could barely hear him, her head spinning from the pain, but she obeyed. She had no strength to fight. Her thoughts were scattered, but she couldn't help but wonder why he was helping her. They weren't friends. In fact, they barely knew each other. Why was he so determined to help a stranger? He had no obligation to her. And yet here he was, doing everything he could to stop the bleeding. For a moment, their eyes met. James's face was a mask of concentration, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. It was not just her injury that caused his hands to shake. There was something deeper, something that went beyond the wound on her leg. But before she could dwell on it, another wave of pain hit her and she squeezed her eyes shut, unable to hold back the tears. The tears surprised her. She had always prided herself on being strong. She had been through so much on her own, and yet here she was, crying like a helpless child. The thought made her angry, but the pain was too much to fight. James, seeing the tears, hesitated for just a moment. His rough hands paused in their work and his heart clenched at the sight. He knew she was strong, knew that a woman like her wouldn't cry unless she was in terrible pain. But there was something else in her eyes, something more than the pain, something that made his own heart ache. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice low. He wasn't sure what he was apologizing for her pain, for his own weakness, but the words felt right. They hung between them, heavy with unsaid things. Sarah couldn't respond. The words wouldn't come, and she didn't have the energy to force them out. But she could feel his presence, steady and unwavering, like a quiet pillar beside her. She wanted to thank him, wanted to say something to show that she appreciated what he was doing, but the words felt like too much. When James finally finished dressing the wound, he gently lifted her up. His hands were still shaking, but his grip was strong. He helped her to her feet, supporting her as she swayed. Disoriented from blood loss and pain, she felt weak, so much weaker than she ever had before. But his strength steadied her. Without a word, James helped her walk to his cabin. She wanted to protest, to insist that she could make it on her own, but her body betrayed her. Every step felt like an eternity, and the cold wind bit at her exposed skin, making her shiver. Finally, they reached the cabin, and James carefully helped her sit on a chair by the fire. The warmth of the cabin was a relief, but it did little to ease the emotional turmoil she was feeling. She felt vulnerable, exposed. She was used to being the one who took care of herself, who never asked for help. But now, in this moment, she realized that sometimes it was okay to rely on someone else. James went to the cupboard and retrieved a few simple supplies to clean the wound more thoroughly. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them. As Sarah sat quietly, she could feel the weight of his actions settling in her chest. She had never known anyone to care like this. It was strange, overwhelming, and humbling. As he worked, Sarah caught herself glancing at his hands. They were still shaking, not from the cold, but from something else. She wanted to ask him why. What was it that made him tremble so much when he touched her? But she didn't have the words, and in that moment, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of the room lull her into a light sleep. Despite the pain, despite the confusion and vulnerability, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel so alone. The days that followed were a blur of pain and quiet care. Sarah woke up to the smell of fresh coffee, a warmth she had not felt in weeks. She was still lying in the small cabin, the same chair where James had helped her earlier. The wound on her leg throbbed, but the worst of it had passed. Her mind, however, was still full of questions she couldn't quite answer. James had taken care of her every day since the accident. He had brought her food, medicine, and the kind of attention that made her feel both grateful and deeply uncomfortable. She was used to doing things for herself. But now she was stuck in the small cabin with nothing to do but rest and allow someone else to take charge. That morning, when she opened her eyes, James was sitting nearby, staring into the fire. His face was as stoic as always, but there was something different about him now, something that made her realize just how much he had been holding back all these years. She didn't know what it was, but she felt it, an invisible thread between them that had begun to tighten with every passing moment. "How are you feeling?" James asked, his voice soft yet steady, the same tone he had always used. But now there was something more, something tender beneath the surface. Sarah shifted in the chair, trying to find a position that didn't make her leg ache too much. She winced as she moved, but she smiled through it, not wanting to show how weak she still felt. "Better, I think. But I'm not used to being taken care of." James nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. "It's nothing," he muttered. "It's what anyone would do." But Sarah knew it wasn't nothing. She could feel the effort in his actions, the way he had moved her without hesitation, the care he took in dressing her wound, even the way his hands trembled when they touched her. It wasn't just about the injury. It was about something deeper, something more personal. And though she couldn't put it into words, she felt that he too was struggling with his own emotions. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question had been on her mind since the first day he had found her lying in the dirt, bleeding and helpless. She had never expected him to come to her aid. It wasn't like they were close. They weren't even friends. And yet he had stayed by her side without asking for anything in return. James looked up then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she had asked the question. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah could see the hesitation in his gaze, as though he was choosing his words carefully, trying to figure out whether he should say what was on his mind. Finally he spoke. "Because I couldn't leave you out there," he said, his voice quiet yet strong. "I know what it's like to be alone, to be hurt and have no one around. I couldn't leave you to suffer like that." Sarah blinked, surprised by the honesty in his words. She had always thought of James as a man who kept to himself, who never allowed anyone too close. But in that moment, she realized that there was more to him than the quiet rancher. There was a depth of feeling, a softness that he had hidden for so long. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James didn't reply. Instead, he stood up, his movements careful as he went to the small stove in the corner of the room to check on the fire. The silence between them hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a moment of understanding, a shared connection that neither of them had expected. As the day went on, Sarah grew stronger. She was able to walk around a little, though still with a limp, and James continued to tend to her needs quietly and without fanfare. It was clear that he wasn't doing it for any reward. He simply wanted to help her, and that was all. In the evening, when the sky turned dark and the first stars began to appear, Sarah sat by the fire, her legs stretched out in front of her. The cabin was warm, the crackling of the fire adding a comforting rhythm to the stillness of the night. James had gone outside to tend to his horse, and for the first time in days, Sarah was alone with her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had cared for her, the tenderness in his actions, the way he had never once seemed bothered by the burden of looking after her. It made her wonder what kind of man he really was, the man behind the quiet, stoic exterior. When James returned, he didn't speak at first. He simply hung his coat on a hook near the door and moved toward the fire, taking a seat across from her. His eyes met hers briefly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the past few days hung between them, a quiet bond that neither of them could ignore. "James," Sarah finally said, her voice a little unsure. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done. You've been more than kind to me." James leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening. "You don't need to repay me," he said quietly. "I didn't do it for anything in return. I did it because you needed help and because I wanted to help." His words sent a warmth through Sarah, and for the first time she felt the weight of her own emotions stir inside her. She had always prided herself on being independent, on never needing anyone. But in that moment she realized how much she had needed James, how much she had needed someone to care, someone to be there when everything else had seemed too much. The silence stretched between them once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't heavy. It was simply a moment of shared understanding. And in that moment, Sarah realized that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who can let themselves feel, who can allow others to see their vulnerability and still stand strong. As the night deepened and the fire slowly burned down, James and Sarah sat in quiet companionship, no longer strangers, but two people who had found something in each other that neither of them had expected. And in the soft glow of the firelight, Sarah knew that she would never forget the kindness James had shown her, the way he had cared for her when she had nothing to offer in return. Sometimes, the greatest strength came not from doing things alone, but from allowing others to help, to offer their support when it was needed the most. And in that quiet cabin in the mountains, Sarah had learned just how much strength lay in the quiet care of a man who, until that moment, had seemed like an island in a sea of solitude.